This is not an easy topic to approach. This is not an easy topic to approach. A man named Richard Wurmbrand was locked away from the world for 14 years and never saw the light of day, only because he had stood up and declared to a communist gathering that there is proof that there is a divine spirit. And the official political stance was that atheism is the state religion. Be aware, be deeply aware that there are two zones of the world that are completely invisible to the undiscerning individual. There is the persecution zones of the world, and there is the freedom of religion zones of the world. In some of the lovely ancient Christian writings, there is an eloquent comment that says, Satan, the darkness, the invisible spirits that wish to destroy life and cause hatred between human beings. Those spirits in the atmosphere of the world, the regions of the world that are against the following of Jesus of Nazareth as the supernatural visitor, the Son of God. In the persecution zones of the world where it is illegal to own a copy of the Messianic scriptures, in the atmospheres of the world where it is illegal to have meetings to communicate together with this Spirit who has sent Jesus of Nazareth. In those environments, the work of the dark side is absolutely bloodthirsty and bizarre. People's legs are chopped off, they're beaten to death, they are tortured in many different ways. Pregnant women are cut open and their children are beaten to death. In physical persecution, the dark side is absolutely bizarre and freaky ugly. But in the persecution of riches, in the atmospheres where there is freedom of religion, Hasatan, the accuser, the destroyer, the death squad, operates with absolute sweetness. One of the greatest ways to destroy a person is to trick them into thinking that they're okay when they are actually in great danger. One of the greatest ways to actually destroy a person is to cause them to become ignorant of the things that they could do to keep themselves safe. When I was 14 years old, I had this deep inner feeling that there was something very, very wrong with the Christianity that I had been raised in for 14 years at that point. And it was also big and complicated, and big fancy meetings and buildings and special people and all this stuff. I mean, I was just a little person. I just knew in my guts there was something very, very, very wrong. And I didn't have any kind of perspective to try to fix it or change it. So I just left. And as the years went on, I kind of became an anti-religious bigot, regardless of retaining a respect for those who really, wanted to do this Jesus, God, church, and Bible stuff. I mean, I didn't have a, condemning, destroying attitude towards anyone, but I just felt like, well, that's your business, and I've got other business, and I don't want to get mixed up in your business. So for the better part of 25 years, I was an anti-religious bigot. And then through a series of events, I began reading a small treatise on the predictions in the Hebrew scriptures that point to this supernatural visitor that apparently has been awaited for all of the history of the human race, which is kind of outlandish, but it's an interesting fairy tale. And so the foundational proofs of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the bizarre duplication rate of the Koine Greek New Testament before the printing press, these two things indicate that there's something weird going on around the Hebrew scriptures and around the Koine Greek New Testament. As I read this thing, I was absolutely shocked and frustrated, because here was some simple proof that all of the Son of God stuff was crystal clear and real. But the handling and the presentation of this thing, to me, especially to me, had been handled in such a poor way that I was surrounded with horrors and terrors, that I had been living in ignorance for the better part of 40 years of my life, and that I had actually not been consulting the invisible divine business advisor and relationship advisor, and like I like to say, the peace of mind injector. I didn't know that when I was in the midst of anxiety and difficulty, that I could actually receive peace and contentment regardless of the apparent troubles and circumstances. So in 1994, I began this horrible job of beginning to tour what I call the church mess in America. I honestly said to the greatest spirit, the God spirit who brought Jesus of Nazareth, I said, look, I don't even want to go into those places. I can tell that there's all this wrong stuff going on, and I don't want to get caught in it. I don't want to get brainwashed. And the answer that I got was, you're right, it's all messed up. Go in anyway, keep your mouth shut and take notes. And I started discovering the most marvelous, beautiful things in all these different corners of the church mess in America. And then I discovered means of researching the first 300 years of people, millions of whom were brutally killed because they were in an outlaw religion. And when I began to look at the day-to-day practices of the early disciples of Yeshua of Nazareth, and as I began to observe waves of peoples who now are obviously going out onto the streets and getting bona fide healings of physical infirmities, driving out of spirits, raising the dead. And people who are walking around even being able to speak out of the eternal heart in order to benefit a person and guide them in their life. As I began to see these clusters of people growing in number who are going around with supernatural powers, as I observed the multiplication in homes of a certain outfit called Zume Project, begun by Curtis Sargent, my amazement continued to increase. But in 61 years of touring all of this church stuff across my whole life, I have never heard one repetitive instruction. And that is, whenever we get together in the homes, first, we gently observe our personal consciences and we feel whether we feel right with God, right with ourselves, and right with other human beings. And if we don't, we cheerfully declare that we take off all masks and we care for one another and carry one another's burdens and difficulties. After the whole reception of Jesus of Nazareth as God, immersion in water, immersion in the Holy Spirit with powers from the other realm, immersion in the teachings, fascinating teachings. After all the immersions and all this stuff, the most important thing above all else is actually checking our hearts together and saying, okay, God's been asking me to do this thing, to go care for this friend of mine. And my friend kind of freaks me out, and I've been putting it off, and I need help from somebody else because I know this is God, the sweet one, asking me to go help with this friend of mine. Those sorts of things I like to say and repeat and emphasize, that when you get baptized in water, you don't become sinless, but rather the troubles that you engage in are in a much higher echelon, a much higher atmosphere, where the Spirit who you've engaged with begins to invite you to speak or do, and you're scared and you don't, and nobody can see you on the outside what's going on. So that's why we need like a check-in atmosphere. Also, I like to constantly repeat that this concept of a pastor shepherd, is just a person, an elder person of some sort who has a lot of compassion, who sits in a little small gathering with friends, and that person is the one who actually says, okay, how are we doing? Do we feel right with God, and do we feel right with ourselves and right with other human beings? If there's somebody that you have a conflict with, speak out and mention that, and we'll help to be peacemakers and mediators and ones who bring reconciliation. And I never, ever, ever, ever had anything like that repetitive, like a couple of times a week in my life. And not any environment that I've ever been in has that been emphasized. And I discovered that for 300 to maybe 1,000 years in the Western Church, which has more records, that was the practice. The most important thing was not prayer and worship and nice teaching. The most important thing was, how are your hearts? And that's crazy, because that really works. I mean, it's nice, it's pleasant, it's reasonable, it's understandable. So, taking 2 steps back, picture yourself in the persecution zone of the world somewhere. You meet with your friends in some basement, and then the next time you meet, you're going to meet by like this big tree in the woods. And then the next time you meet, you're going to meet in some other place, because you can't meet repetitively in one place, because you'll be found out and a bunch of you might be killed. So you're working every angle just to be together. You're in a constant vigilance, and your whole life is consumed by both interacting with the sweet spirit and kind of staying alive and loving other people. But in the environment of the freedom of religion atmosphere, it's very easy to basically get in the state of like, oh, I'm saved, let's go back to life as usual. When in fact, there are layers of fascinating things that Jesus of Nazareth taught to the apostles that were going on for 300 years in the homes. All of these little practices and things. For example, corporate fasting. We, the little bundle of us in our communion group, we fast on Wednesdays and on Fridays. And the instruction is, there's no absolute rigid rule. Do the best you can. So, some people have a little bread and water at some of the prayer times at noon and at 6 or something like that. Some people fast from meat or solid foods. But the children are raised with this atmosphere of like, we are a special family team together, and we're sort of saying no to the things of the body and the senses, and we're saying yes to increasing our interaction with God, the Sweet One. So there's all these things, marvelous things, that were taught right from the Son of God. For example, keeping up the times of prayer and praying on our knees, except for the day that we call the resurrection day, or the first day of the week, or the 8th day. The day that Yeshua resurrected was referred to as the 8th day, as if there was a brand new age or season. Here's the deal. There are so many little things that we can do to hedge out the spirits of darkness. And we have generally been blinded to these. And now with the internet and fast access to information, we as a family, just as a family group, a little communion group, we can actually put into practice all these pleasant little things that are not that complicated, but that actually stand as a hedge against the infiltration of unclean spirits, who will actually cause us to feel like we're okay and cause us to begin to engage in acts of selfishness and begin to act and behave in a way that's blind to the greatest benefits that we can be engaged in. Like, we're supposed to be a little communion group from which there's a handful of people that are going out on the streets every day with power and miracles and signs and wonders. And they come home to the dinner table and tell us the marvelous stories that have happened throughout the day. Whether it's a pair of people sitting on the internet and doing a loving and caring of other people through the web, or whether it's physically out on the street, we are a beautiful little intimate communion group where our hearts are completely open to one another. And even from childhood, we've got a basic review of all the little ways that human beings can get obsessed or dumb or weak. It's so marvelous. But there's all these missing things. And they're sprinkled through the church atmospheres. And then the discovery that a thing called the apostles' teachings, or the teachings of Christ, read 2 John 8-11. Read the place in Timothy where it says, give these teachings to trustworthy men who can teach them to others. 1 Corinthians 11 in the beginning, I am so glad that you hold to the traditions. This is not the traditions of the Jew. These are the things that the Son of God taught for ordinary people to be in their best interface with God. I mean, this is really groovy stuff. It's really marvelous. But there's an oral tradition. There is a set of teachings. There's an oral tradition that is not spelled out and outlined in the New Testament. But through research, you can actually find the places where there's slight mentions of these things in the New Testament. And then there's like this bouquet of detailed explanations that are in the early church writings before Constantine and the Roman Empire stuff. So, dangerous. Christianity in the freedom of religion zones of this world, Christianity in North America is very dangerous because it has literally built into it an enticement for hearts and minds to think that everything is okay when there's a lot of missing stuff. I'm nobody special. I'm just a ravenous researcher who loves the details. And I invite you to come along on this ride with me and rethink everything that you do. I mean, one of the most marvelous things in all the scriptures is Romans chapter 2, where it says, human beings have a conscience. And the people who operate with a good conscience are being viewed by the God, the Spirit, that they might not even acknowledge. And a person who operates with a good conscience, who rejects the God information, compared to a person who has all the God information and actually operates very poorly with a poor conscience. How is God going to judge? There's a rhetorical statement. And the statement basically means, hey, the atheist who operates with a beautiful conscience will be accepted by the God that they don't even want to look at. And the ones that are carrying all the God information, who are terribly misbehaving, just being just plain stupid, blind, and ugly, those will be set aside, rejected, or at least they will experience loss. 1 Corinthians 3. Once you have come into sozo, into wholeness, now you're living a life and you're building a life, and you can either use cheap, sloppy materials that don't really retain goodness, or you can pay the emotional price and change your lifestyle and your perspectives, and you can build with things that actually last straight into the next breath. So stay tuned, be deeply concerned, and do your research. All the best to all of you.